My first big skiing trip ever was with my friends Audrey, Edith, and Louisa, and we all flew to Colorado. We rented an Airbnb in the town of Snowmass, right by Aspen Mountain Ski Resort. I had only been snowboarding one other time in my life at this point, and that consisted of riding down the bunny hill over and over. I was pretty bad. The first thing we did from the airport was Uber straight to the Airbnb. It was a spacious 4-bedroom house with a huge deck and a hot tub overlooking the Colorado countryside. Since it was nighttime already by the time we got there, we went out to some local bar on the first night, which was a Thursday. The next day, we went straight to the mountain via Uber. We got our rental equipment at the mountain to make things easier. It actually wasn't super crowded on the first day, probably because it was a work day. The next day, it got a lot more crowded. For some reason, I just couldn't really get the hang of it. I couldn't make it down a slope without falling at least a few times. At a certain point, I was so fed up that I just sat on the side of a slope to catch my breath and take a break. Meanwhile, a bunch of people zoomed past me, even little kids that made it look easy. Then came this man who seemed like he didn't really know what he was doing either. He came up to me and asked if I was okay and started trying to make conversation with me. It was the weirdest spot to make conversation, so after a few seconds of answering his questions, I got up and said, "Nice talking to you," and resumed trying to snowboard down the mountain. This mountain was a blue run, meaning it was a longer slope to get down and slightly more difficult than a green. I stopped again a little further down the mountain to take another break. I really wasn't having fun. To my dismay, I saw that guy from before approaching me again. He was inching closer to me with the same struggle I had been dealing with. He stopped right next to me, unstrapped from his snowboard, then sat a few feet from me. He started talking to me about how he's not used to so many pretty girls like me being here. This was super weird because I had on a ski mask and helmet, my face was practically covered. He asked who I was here with. I lied and said my boyfriend. He laughed and said he saw me come here with all girls. I looked at him and said, "Ew," really loud, and then got back on my snowboard and continued down the mountain. It's weird, but I snowboarded better than I ever had in that moment, perhaps because I had the proper motivation to just get down the mountain. When I got to the bottom, I immediately went to the lodge and sat at one of the tables, calling each of my friends. Edith was the first one to pick up. I explained what just happened and asked her to just come sit with me. A few minutes later, I saw her walking over to me. I had already texted our group chat, saying we should leave. It was already around 3 o'clock anyway, we'd been there a few hours. When Audrey and Louisa finished whatever run they were on, they met us back at the lodge. We returned our rental gear and then Ubered back to the Airbnb. We all showered and changed, then headed out to the village for dinner. We then went out to a few of the local bars afterward and got decently drunk. When we came back to the Airbnb, we all four went into the hot tub on the deck and drank more alcohol. After a while, we all eventually went to our rooms to go to sleep. I'm basically an insomniac, and I stayed up on my phone for over an hour, scrolling on Instagram. Even as I was still buzzed, I wasn't tired, and this was a very, very good thing that may have saved us. I heard footsteps out in the common area, either the living room or the kitchen. The Airbnb had wood floors throughout. Initially, I thought it was one of the girls going to the bathroom or getting water, but then I heard the doorknob to my door twisting. I sat up and was about to say one of their names, but I stopped myself because why would one of them be trying to come into my room? I instantly went to the group chat to text everyone and ask who that was. Nobody answered, they must have been asleep. I tiptoed to the door and put my ear up against it, I heard footsteps moving around. When it went quiet, I ever so quietly unlocked the door and twisted the doorknob. I pushed the door open as gently as I could and peeked into the living room. I looked from corner to corner until I saw a tall black silhouette walking from one door to the other. It was a man for sure. He was trying to get into one of our rooms. I wanted to scream out to my friends to warn them, but I stayed silent because I was too scared. I closed my door quietly and locked it. I prayed to God everyone had their doors locked. 4 girls in one Airbnb, though, of course, we did. I called 911 quietly and whispered the entire time into the phone. That's when I heard the light knocks on my bedroom door. I turned to the door and watched as the doorknob started to turn, but he couldn't open it. I kept saying, "Please hurry," into the phone. All the woman on the line kept saying back was, "They're almost here," and to remain quiet. It was entirely possible that the man on the other side of the door heard me whispering because he started pushing into the door. I heard shoves and bangs on the door, and I just couldn't help it anymore. I screamed, "Get out of here," followed by, "I'm on the phone with 911 right now." The banging stopped, and a voice on the other side said, "Okay, sweetheart," and then I heard his footsteps walking away. The 911 operator instructed me to stay in the room until police should arrive. I peeked outside the window, but it was simply too dark to see anything beyond a few feet in front of the window. My friends were awake now from my screams. I told them all to stay in their rooms. Police finally got there about 5 to 10 minutes later, and they came right into the Airbnb since the door was unlocked. Once it was confirmed the intruder was gone, we ensured every entry point was locked and secured, and then they left. Sleeping after that was difficult, of course. The idea came up that it was that creepy man from the mountain who was following me, and I do believe that's a possibility. The voice could have been a match, honestly. After working out a partial refund with the Airbnb host, we spent Sunday traveling the area instead of snowboarding again, and we stayed at a small motel Sunday night. We flew home Monday morning. For a very short period of my life, I want to say I was around 14 or 15. I lived in a fairly small house in Vermont. My family didn't live there long. It was located in the forest and far from almost everything, making any task that required leaving the house pretty inconvenient. However, there's one experience I had at that house in the time I lived there that I'll likely never forget. It happened in January. I only remember that because I can recall New Year's Day being just a few days earlier. My cousin Gwen and I were both still on school break at the time and had planned to spend the night at my place. This was something we would often do. We would typically stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. playing Xbox, watching movies, or something along those lines. This would all happen in the living room. This night, we had been watching a movie. I don't remember what movie it was, but that's not important. What I do remember is being maybe halfway through the movie when Gwen kept looking out the window just slightly to the right of where we were sitting. It got to the point where, like every minute, I could see his head move out of the corner of my eye. Now, I should mention that on that night there was a fairly bad snowstorm happening. At first, I just thought he'd been watching the snowfall until I realized just how long he had been staring out the window for. I asked him what he was looking at. He kept staring and responded, saying how he thought he saw something. This instantly filled me with anxiety. I think this was mostly due to where we lived. Wild animals weren't all that common, and like I mentioned earlier, we didn't really live near anything. So, someone on our property, especially at this hour and during a snowstorm, would be cause for concern. Nothing happened for a couple of minutes. I kept asking follow-up questions, but he just told me to be quiet, as if to be able to focus. That's when we saw it, the clear shadow of a person sprinting from one tree to the next. Both of us physically jumped in reaction. There was no sound, but the sheer sight alone was enough to startle us. Now, this was a good 200 feet out from the house, so we couldn't exactly tell if the person was coming closer or not. We both looked at each other and right back out the window, I guess as a way to confirm what we had just seen. A couple of minutes of this went by when it happened again, but this time much further to the left of where the first sighting had occurred. Slowly over time, the sightings became more frequent. It was clear by this point that there was more than just one person. Eventually, one of the figures got out from behind a tree, but this time instead of moving behind another one, it just stood there. After a couple of seconds, the figure started sprinting in our direction. This was enough to break us out of our sort of trance of disbelief, and we ran. I ran straight upstairs to wake up my dad, but by the time he got up and followed me downstairs, there was no one visible outside. Gwen and I both explained to him what we had seen. Typically, I don't think my dad would have believed us, but I guess he was able to see the genuine panic in our eyes. We all went around the house verifying all the doors and windows were locked. My dad then went outside armed with a weapon. He briefly walked around the house before returning inside, but he found nothing. That night, we convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us. Come morning, the snowstorm had almost completely stopped. We went outside to better assess the situation in the daylight, and we found multiple sets of footprints in the snow next to the trees facing our living room's window. They were pretty filled in from the snowstorm but still clearly visible and recognizable as footprints. There were even some around the house, like on top of the footprints my dad had made the night before. I even talked to my dad about it, and he said those had not been there when he went outside. Even more disturbing, our shed had been left completely open, with the only thing stolen being our knives we used for hunting. None of this, however, was enough to get my dad to call the cops. He always had this "we take care of our own" mentality, and I guess he just never saw calling 911 as an option. We moved out of that house 2 weeks later, not because of the incident, but rather because that just happened to be when we had planned to move. I was extremely grateful for this. At least as far as I know, nothing happened in those 2 weeks. This whole experience still freaks me out to this day. Seeing firsthand multiple people on your isolated property in the middle of the night and during a snowstorm is straight out of a nightmare, and I do my best not to think about it. My family owns a property in Vermont that we use in the wintertime for skiing and snowboarding. It's at the top of a hill surrounded by woods. The nearest neighbors are up the road, but separated enough where you can't see their houses from our property. There's a big shed outside that we keep a lot of our snowboarding gear along with general lawn care stuff like shovels, rakes, and everything like that. We keep the shed locked whenever we aren't up there. Once we unlock it, though, we keep it unlocked for the entirety of our visits, as we don't really worry too much about people coming and stealing anything while we're there. The actual house is pretty nicely sized. It's technically 3 floors, with the 3rd floor being a loft master bedroom, which is reserved for my parents, and my siblings and I aren't allowed to use it. This one weekend, I was heading up there with this girl Gloria, who I was going to be teaching how to snowboard as she had never been before. We had a beginner board up there that she used, along with all the proper equipment. On our property, since it's on a steep hill, we actually made our own little custom slope that we'd sometimes snowboard or sled down for fun. So before taking her to the actual mountain, I suggested I teach her the basics on the hill. We put on all of our gear and rode up to the top of the hill. I slowly started descending, showing her the basic movements. When she made her first attempt, she right away fell, as expected. But she was persistent and kept trying and getting back up each time. We made it to the bottom of the hill. She'd get a little better, and then we'd walk back up and do it again. At some point, we both heard a male voice call out from the woods, presumably at us. It said, "Hello." We started looking around, confused as hell. All we saw were a bunch of trees and a white sheet of snow covering the floor of the woods. You'd think it would be easier to spot someone or something when it's just a sheet of white surrounding you, but nope, we didn't see anyone in the woods. I yelled out, "Is someone there?" Nothing. Now just the dead silence of a secluded place in the winter. Gloria and I were slightly disturbed, so we walked back up to the house and went inside. I didn't think it could be the neighbors because I didn't see the driveway to the one we passed shoveled, and the neighbors further up the hill would have no reason to come down like that. I told her it must have been some random person going for a hike in the woods. That was the least scary possibility. The next thing we did was go out to my favorite nearby diner. Then we went shopping for basic groceries to get us through the next few days. Since it was a bit late now, we were going to spend the rest of the night just chilling at the house. We ate dinner and then chilled by the fire pit out back. At some point, we both heard the distinct sound of shoes stepping in snow not far away. I turned off the music for a second, but with the sound of the crackling fire, it still wasn't dead silence. By this point, whatever we heard had stopped. I asked for her phone so I could use both my and her phone's flashlights to point into the woods. Again, like earlier, I called out, "Is someone there?" which scared Gloria. She asked to go inside, so we did. We didn't go back outside that night. The next morning, I woke up to Gloria getting out of bed. I was still tired, so I went back to sleep. When I woke up again, she was still not in the bed anymore. I looked at the time, and it was already like 9 a.m., so I got up and opened the curtain to the window. I looked out at the shed outside. The door was open, and I saw the breath of someone being blown from behind the door to the shed. I wondered what Gloria was doing out there. I opened the window and yelled Gloria's name, but when she called back, her voice came from inside the house, right in the living room. I got goosebumps. I kept watching the escaping breath of whoever was in our shed blow out the door. I yelled outside, "Yo, who's in my shed?" A few seconds later, I shut the window and ran out to the living room to find Gloria watching TV, or rather now she was more so just standing in front of the couch, concerned. I looked out the back door and saw the back of somebody dressed in black running into the woods. I looked for my boots, but by the time I put them on, it was too late to chase him. I went to check the shed to see if anything was stolen, but it seemed everything was there. I relocked the shed just to be safe. I saw the footprints of that person lead from the woods to the shed, then back to the woods again. I wasn't about to follow the footprints, though. After nerves calmed a bit, we ate breakfast, then headed for the mountain, and we had a whole day of snowboarding. Gloria picked it up surprisingly well, and we planned to have one more day at it tomorrow. After we got back to the house, we cooked a steak dinner, then watched a movie. We didn't want to sit out in the dark again after last night and earlier that day. In the middle of that night, I woke up to Gloria shaking me. She explained why, then she told me to listen. We sat in silence for about 30 seconds before we heard, "Help me," in a very long drawn-out voice from outside. Gloria was in hysterics. Then we heard the voice again. I went over to the window and she begged me not to open the curtain. I said I was just going to take a peek. I gently lifted one corner of the curtain to peek outside. I don't know what I was expecting to see except for total blackness. I cracked the window open and a gust of cold air hit me in the face. I listened, intending on getting a better idea of where this voice was coming from. Then I suddenly heard footsteps in the snow getting much louder very quickly. They were coming toward the window. I quickly pulled it down and relocked it. Whoever it was had already seen me, though. The knock on the window confirmed it. I looked over at Gloria, who was hiding under the blanket making faint crying noises. I told her to just stay quiet. Our best response was to not respond or acknowledge them. There was never another tap at the window, nor were there any more calls from outside. It was a long couple of hours after that of not sleeping. Eventually, though, we got so tired that we did end up just falling asleep. The next morning, I checked around the house and there were footprints literally surrounding the house. Someone, or multiple people, had been circling the house, apparently going from window to window. We decided we'd leave early because clearly someone was stalking us from the moment we got there. I locked everything back away in the shed, then we packed the car and back to Rhode Island we went. For those curious, nothing was broken into or stolen the next time any of us went back up there. So truthfully, I don't even really have a guess as to what that person out there wanted, but it was most definitely the same person stalking the house from the moment we got there. It might have been multiple people. When you're up in an isolated place like that, realizing you're not alone is the scariest thing imaginable. I like to start off by saying I have been living in Boston my whole life. I am also the type of person that does not get out often, so for the most part, I've only ever known the city and the surrounding areas. I met a girl earlier last year on Tinder, and we happened to hit it off right away. She and I hung out all summer, and that fall, we started to officially date. She was from New York City, Brooklyn to be exact. We have fun going back and forth about the Red Sox and the Yankees, which added a deeper element to our bond together. Everything in the relationship was going great so far, so with New Year's coming up, we decided we wanted to spend it together. We were still in the honeymoon stage, so nothing seemed better than ditching our friends and having a romantic getaway together. Now, Vermont is one of the states that is right above Massachusetts. A lot of you may already know that, but for the ones that don't, there you have it. Since she had never been up that way, and nor had I decided to rent a cabin at a ski resort for an extended weekend getaway. We couldn't help but think about all the fun that we were going to have, and we were both excited to say the least. Since we would be arriving on the morning of New Year's Eve, I went to Boston Market the day before and got us a nice meal for that night. I had also hit the grocery store just to be sure that we would have all the food we would need for that weekend. I woke up early New Year's Eve morning around 4 a.m. I got everything ready and was at her place a little after 5 a.m. We got breakfast and hit the highway, excited for the adventure ahead of us. The drive was about 4 hours to the cabin, and I listened to podcasts while she slept in the passenger seat. We finally arrived at the cabin, and the scenery was absolutely stunning. Immediately, I felt bad for not getting out and about a little sooner in life, being in my late 20s at this point. We pulled up out front of a nice, newly renovated cabin. It had a wood welcome sign on the front door with a neat little black bear carved into it. My girlfriend, being the nature lover that she is, admired the sign as I put in the key code to get into the place. Once inside, we had a look around, and the place had a very nice and cozy vibe. For the price I was paying for the weekend, would not expect anything less. We started to unload the car and bring the food and luggage inside. We went out for a day of skiing after that, and when we got back, we showered, took a nap, and then got up and prepared dinner. This place had all the amenities, so we were able to warm up the food and cook a little, no problem. The giant wood-burning fireplace kept things nice and toasty in the main living and dining space. While cooking, my girl decided to crack a window just to let a little bit of the heat out. Everything was ready to eat, so we sat down at the table and had a nice candlelit dinner. The food turned out to be great, and after that, we talked and laughed and just enjoyed each other's company. We went to the bedroom for a bit of fun before falling asleep. We were going to stay up to watch the ball drop, but with all the action from that day, there was not a chance. There's something about someone screaming bloody murder while you're asleep that wakes you up in the most gut-wrenching of ways. Frantically jumping up, I called out for my girlfriend. Before I knew it, she was flying through the threshold of the door, slamming it behind her. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "There's a bear currently breaking into our cabin." Right when she said that, you could hear glass shattering violently in the background. I went to the door and pressed my ear to it. I could hear snow coming from the outside. I got ballsy and looked out the door. We had cut the lights off before heading into the bedroom, so it was dark as hell outside. But the light from the embers in the fireplace gave off just enough light for me to see a giant black bear trying to crawl through the kitchen window, but it had not yet made it all the way in. How could this be happening right now? Then it all hit me. Caught up in the festivities earlier, we forgot to put the food away. Our whole spread was still out on the dining room table. Also, we never closed the window from when we were cooking earlier. We basically gave a signal to all the local wildlife to come and get it. I feel very stupid now looking back on it all, but like I said earlier, this was a new experience for me and not getting out of the city much before, so I know, rookie mistake. I tried yelling and making myself look big, but it still seemed to be pretty persistent on coming in. I told her to hurry and get dressed as I looked around on the floor for my clothes. There was a window in my room which led out to the parking area. Luckily, I had my car keys in the room with me, so I helped her out of the window with me following up behind her. We hopped in my car, and I immediately started it and cut the heat on. We were half-dressed and it was probably about 30 degrees out. I drove around to the side of the house where the bear was stuck in the window and held onto my car horn for at least a minute straight. That startled the heck out of that bear, and it finally pulled itself from the window and ran back off into the woods. We were both shaken to the core and did not want to go back into the cabin that night. We decided to just sleep in the car with it running so that we could stay warm. I sent an email to the resort letting them know what had happened that night. As we sat in the car trying to come down from that adrenaline high, that's when she first told me how she encountered the bear before she had screamed and awoke me. She was on her way to the restroom when she noticed a dark shadow lingering around outside the kitchen window. We did eventually crash, only to be awoken by the sunrise a few hours later. The site manager from the resort pulled up a little after 7 a.m., and we all walked back inside the cabin together. He paced around the scene slowly, analyzing everything carefully. He then began to chastise us for leaving food out and the window opened in the first place. We gave him our sincerest apologies, letting him know that this lifestyle was new to us. We even offered to pay for the window. He declined our offer and said that he would have it fixed by that evening. We decided to check out the nearby small town that day, visit a few shops, and maybe have a little dinner. It was nice because it helped take our minds off of the wild night before. By the time we got back into the cabin, everything was fixed and good as new. The first night sleeping in there again was pretty nerve-wracking, but nothing ended up happening. The rest of the weekend went off without a hitch. Me and that particular young lady do not date anymore. We had some differences and decided to go our separate ways. But at least we share the memory of almost getting robbed and maybe even mauled by a bear.